Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the year 536 AD, a time when the sky went black, crops failed, and love got creative. Picture this. You wake up to a world where the sun is just a faint, hazy smudge behind a thick veil of ash. The air is cold, even in summer. Your stomach growls, but the grain silos are empty. And yet, in the dim glow of oil lamps, people are clinging to each other, whispering secrets, trading warmth for comfort. Romance in 536 isn't about flowers or poetry. It's about survival. You probably wouldn't last a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see who's listening from where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the silence. No birds. No wind through the trees. Just the occasional cough from a neighbor's hut, the kind that doesn't sound like it'll end well. The volcanic fog has been hanging for months, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. But humans, we're stubborn. Even in the worst years, we find ways to connect. Take the brothels of Constantinople. Normally, they're places of vice, sure, but in 536, they're makeshift shelters. Prostitutes aren't just selling pleasure, they're selling warmth. A body to curl up against when the nights are colder than a tomb. Historians still argue whether this was exploitation or mutual survival, but records show some of these women became minor legends, their names whispered like saints. Then there's the really strange stuff. Like the brides of the fog, women who claimed the ash cloud was a living thing, a lover that wrapped around them at night. Some even swore they conceived children by it. Spoiler, they didn't. But try telling them that. And let's not forget the fringe cults where intimacy was part ritual, part last-ditch effort to beg the gods for mercy. Mainstream history will tell you about the volcanic eruptions, the crop failures. But the quirky truth. People wrote love letters in the margins of religious texts, as if defiance against despair was its own kind of romance. One surviving scrap from Alexandria reads, "If the sun won't return, then let your hands be my light." So yeah, 536 wasn't just famine and death. It was also the year humanity proved that even in the darkest times, we'll still flirt with doom. The sky isn't just grey, it's wrong. Like someone stretched a funeral shroud over the entire world. You step outside, squinting at what should be dawn, but the light never comes. Just this dim, sickly glow, like the sun's been smothered under a pillow. The air smells like burnt stone, and every breath feels thicker, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself is mourning. Birds don't sing anymore. They've either starved or flown south, if there even is a south left untouched by this creeping darkness. You're not a scientist. You're just some poor farmer or baker or maybe a kid who doesn't understand why your parents keep whispering when they think you're asleep, but even you know this isn't normal. The priests call it God's wrath. The drunk in the tavern insists it's dragons. The truth. A volcano, probably halfway across the world, has vomited so much ash into the sky that it strangled the sunlight. But nobody in 536 knows that. All you know is that the crops are failing, the nights are endless, and the cold is gnawing. Here's the mainstream fact. This wasn't just one volcano. Ice cores from Greenland show evidence of multiple eruptions around 536, a one-two punch of natural disaster that plunged the northern hemisphere into a decade of misery. Temperatures dropped, harvests withered, and societies started to unravel. But let's talk about the quirky bit, because humans always find weird ways to cope. In some villages, people started eating sky bread. No, not manna from heaven. Just flour mixed with powdered tree bark and whatever weeds hadn't died yet. It tasted like despair and gave you stomach cramps, but hey, it was something. And then there were the sun catchers, folks who swore they could trap the last dregs of sunlight in polished stones or bowls of water. Spoiler, they couldn't. Historians still argue whether the fog was pure volcanic fallout or if a comet's tail added to the mess. Either way, the result was the same. A year when even noon felt like twilight, and every shadow seemed hungry. You wake to the sound of your own stomach growling, a hollow, aching reminder that breakfast today is the same as yesterday. Nothing. The grain stores are empty. The livestock are skeletal. Even the rats have disappeared, either eaten or fled. Outside, the fields that should be golden with wheat are grey and brittle, stalks snapping like old bones underfoot. This isn't just a bad harvest. This is the land itself giving up. Here's the brutal truth. When crops fail, society starts eating itself. Literally. The mainstream records from Constantinople mention famine markets where desperate families trade heirlooms for a handful of mouldy barley. But the darker stories, those get whispered. Villages where travelers go missing. Graves found disturbed. There's a reason the laws of the time suddenly include harsh penalties for meat of unknown origin. But let's not skip the weird part, because history's darkest moments always have a surreal edge. In some regions, people start eating ghost bread, loaves baked with powdered bone ash, said to carry the strength of the dead. It doesn't. Others swear by hunger stones, pebbles soaked in broth and sucked on to trick the belly. And then there are the fasting saints, religious hermits who claim their starvation is divine, until their followers realize they're just slowly dying. Historians still argue whether cannibalism was widespread or just a horror story used to scare kids. But one thing's certain, in 536, the line between survival and savagery gets thinner by the day. The plague arrives quietly at first, a fever here, a cough there. Then the bodies start piling up in the streets. You'd think this would kill desire, but somehow, it does the opposite. When death lingers in every doorway, people cling harder to anything that feels alive. Brothels stay open, but now the transactions are different. It's not just about pleasure, it's about feeling human again, even for an hour. Some courtesans dab perfume on plague sores to mask the rot. Others whisper they're immune, their bodies blessed by saints or curses. They're not. Then there are the dancing plagues. Whole groups of feverish survivors twitching in the town square, their movements somewhere between lust and delirium. Some claim it's demons. Others say it's just the madness of a world coming apart. Historians still argue whether the dancing was mass hysteria or a fungal infection. But one thing's clear, in 536, even intimacy wears a death's head grin. The plague arrives like a thief in the night, first as whispers at the market, then as empty chairs at supper tables, until finally it's the ever-present rattle of death carts rolling through the streets. But here's what the history books don't prepare you for. The way human desire doesn't disappear in the face of annihilation, it mutates. When every breath could be your last, touch becomes both more dangerous and more desperate. You'd think the brothels would be the first to close, but they become strange sanctuaries. The air inside is thick with the scent of vinegar and crushed herbs, crude attempts to ward off miasmas. The workers wear amulets filled with everything from garlic to dried scorpions, claiming protection against the pestilence. Some clients don't even come for sex, they pay just to be held, to feel another warm body against theirs in a world growing colder by the day. There are rumors of certain establishments where the courtesans will cradle grown men like infants, singing lullabies as the city outside coughs itself to death. Then there are the plague brides, women who marry dying men for their last possessions, only to repeat the process with the next feverish suitor. It's not romance, but it's a kind of intimacy nonetheless. The church condemns them, but when whole families are being wiped out in a week, morality becomes as flexible as a starving man's spine. But the real surrealism comes with the dancing plagues. You've heard of the Black Death's Danse Macabre. In 536, it's not allegory. Whole villages succumb to jerking, twitching fits, bodies moving without rest until their feet bleed on the cobblestones. Some claim it's divine punishment. Others whisper it's the only way to stay warm as the volcanic winter deepens. The afflicted often collapse into each other's arms afterward, their exhausted couplings more about shared survival than passion. Historians still argue whether these outbreaks were mass psychogenic illness or the result of ergot poisoning from moldy grain. But the accounts are clear about one thing: in the shadow of the apocalypse, people will trade their last crust of bread for one more night of pretending they're not already ghosts. The fringe records tell of even stranger intimacies, couples who vow to die together in each other's arms, only for one to miraculously recover. Grave diggers who develop unsettling attachments to the bodies they bury, and the rise of plague marriages where two survivors wed over a loved one's corpse, believing the shared grief will protect them from further loss. Mainstream history focuses on the death tolls, but the real story is how love and lust refuse to die even when everything else does. In Constantinople, physicians note a surge in pregnancies despite the famine, as if the human body itself is rebelling against extinction. The children born 9 months after the worst of the darkness are called ash babies, and whether they're considered cursed or blessed depends entirely on whether their parents survive to name them. As the world outside the palace walls crumbles, Emperor Justinian paces the length of his gilded chambers, his silk slippers whispering against marble floors that grow colder with each passing month. The mosaics depicting his glorious victories seem to mock him now. What use are conquests when your people are eating their own dead? Yet here, in this bubble of flickering oil lamps and desperate pretense, the emperor maintains his divine certainty. You can smell the fear beneath the incense. The mainstream historical record shows Justinian doubling down on both religious fervor and military campaigns during this period, as if he could pray and conquer his way out of catastrophe. His infamous Corpus Juris Civilis legal reforms continue unabated, even as the empire's breadbaskets wither. There's something tragically comic about scribes meticulously recording new tax codes while, just beyond the city gates, farmers sell their children for a week's worth of moldy grain. But the truly bizarre details emerge from Procopius' secret histories, the scathing tell-all he wrote under pseudonym. He describes court eunuchs smuggling in virgins from plague-ravaged villages, many already showing symptoms, their bodies rubbed with stolen perfumes to disguise the telltale buboes. Justinian's wife Theodora, herself a former actress no stranger to using sexuality as power, reportedly hosted increasingly elaborate banquets where guests were served illusion foods, carved turnips posing as roasted pheasant, muddy water passed off as aged wine. The emperor's inner circle played along, pretending to savor each non-existent delicacy while their ribs showed through their tunics. Historians still argue whether Justinian truly believed his own propaganda, or if this was performance art on an imperial scale. The archaeological record shows coins minted during this period bearing unusually radiant depictions of the sun, a cruel joke given the perpetual gloom outside. Meanwhile, the emperor's architects kept building, their scaffolds rising into the ash-choked skies like skeletal fingers grasping for a heaven that never answered. The palace's most disturbing secret. The sunrooms, chambers where hundreds of oil lamps burned day and night, their heat maintained by teams of slaves who worked in shifts. Here, the elite would gather to bask in artificial warmth, their skin turning sallow from lack of true sunlight. Some courtiers became addicted to these spaces, refusing to leave until their lips cracked from dehydration. There were whispers of orgiastic rituals conducted in these false daylight chambers, though whether this was desperate hedonism or some attempt at sympathetic magic remains unclear. What we know for certain is that while the emperor played at guardhood, the real power brokers were the palace chefs who learned to stretch a single chicken across 12 courses, the bath attendants who recycled the same water for weeks, and the slave girls who discovered that a well-placed whisper about divine visions could earn them an extra crust of bread. The aristocracy's attempts to maintain normalcy became increasingly surreal. Banquet invitations specifying that guests should dress lightly because no one had fuel to warm large spaces, poetry competitions about the beauty of twilight, since no one remembered true daylight, and the fashion for famine rouge. A makeup trend where noblewomen painted their cheeks with berry juices to mimic the glow of health their starved bodies could no longer produce. The empire's death rattle took many forms. In the law courts, judges accepted bribes in food rather than gold. In the theatres, actors performed plays about bountiful harvests to hollow laughter. And in the palace, the emperor continued signing documents with a steady hand, even as his people gnawed on tree bark outside the gates. The disconnect between ruler and ruled had never been more complete, nor more dangerous. As the sun's absence stretches from months into years, a new kind of entrepreneur emerges from the gloom, the darkness merchants. These enterprising souls have recognized what the priests and politicians haven't, that despair can be moneized just as easily as hope. You find them at every crossroads and cathedral step, hawking their wares with the fervor of carnival barkers. The mainstream historical record shows organized religion flourishing during this period, but the reality on the ground is far stranger. Enterprising clerics begin selling certified darkness relics, Vials of ash claimed to be from the original volcanic eruption, guaranteed, for a price, to protect your home from further divine wrath. The more creative ones offer sin assessments, where they'll determine exactly which of your transgressions brought this punishment upon your village. Naturally, absolution comes with a sliding scale of donations. But the real money is in apocalypse tourism. Wealthy citizens from less affected regions pay handsomely to be guided through the most devastated areas, where they can gawk at skeletal peasants and purchase authentic famine art, crude sculptures made from chewed bark and animal bones. The particularly macabre can even commission plague portraits, capturing their likeness alongside terminally ill subjects as a memento mori. Historians still argue whether this represents capitalism's resilience or humanity's capacity for exploitation in even the worst circumstances. What's undeniable is how quickly new forms of currency emerge. Church bells get melted down not for weapons, but for small darkness tokens, coin-like objects bearing images of eclipsed suns that some claim hold mystical value. More practical folk begin using nails as currency, leading to the bizarre spectacle of bankers weighing bags of hardware while outside, people starve. The fringe economies are where things get truly strange. Breath brokers sell jars of untainted air collected from mountaintops. Dream interpreters offer to analyze your nightmares for signs of the sun's return. There's even a thriving market in last words. Scribes will follow the dying to record their final utterances, which are then sold as either warnings or prophesies depending on the buyer's needs. Perhaps most unsettling are the darkness dowries. With traditional marriage arrangements collapsing, families now offer their daughters with promises like "this one can subsist on 2 olives a day" or "she's survived 3 fevers already." The marriage contracts increasingly include clauses about corpse disposal and inheritance of meager food stores. Meanwhile, the churches aren't just selling salvation, they're stocking up on it. While commoners starve, monastery storehouses bulge with emergency grain supplies. Some particularly cynical abbots begin offering famine futures. Pay now for a guaranteed loaf should supplies run critically low. When challenged, they claim it's God's will that some should eat while others don't, conveniently ignoring that the deciding factor always seems to be wealth. The black market thrives in the literal sense. Traders draped in soot-blackened cloaks move through the night, offering goods no one questions too closely. Is that really wheat flour, or ground bone? Is that meat lamb or something else? The prices fluctuate wildly based on rumors of relief convoys that never arrive. In this upside-down economy, traditional skills become worthless while new specialties emerge. The once respected miller now begs in the streets while the mold expert, who can identify which fungi are barely edible, commands a small fortune. Teachers now instruct children not in letters, but in which tree barks can be safely consumed. As the years drag on, the darkness economy evolves. What began as exploitation becomes something more complex, a web of mutual survival where everyone's cheating everyone else, yet somehow the whole fragile system persists. The rich pay the poor to take their place in plague quarantine zones. Doctors sell immunity by injecting patients with pus from survivors. The boundaries between commerce, medicine, and religion blur until they're meaningless. The most successful operators aren't the ones with the most coins, but those who control information. The scribe who knows which villages still have food. The messenger who can predict which roads are safe. The priest who's memorized which biblical passages offer the most comfort and which justify the highest tithes. In a world without sunlight, knowledge becomes the most valuable and dangerous commodity of all. When survival becomes measured in degrees rather than days, human ingenuity takes unsettling turns. You'd be shocked what people will trade for a few hours of warmth when the volcanic winters grip tightens. The brothels of 536 aren't just houses of pleasure anymore. They've become the most sought-after shelters in town, though not for the reasons you might expect. The mainstream historical record shows temperatures dropping so severely that Mediterranean ports saw ice formations for the first time in living memory. But the real story unfolds in the shadows, where a new economy of body heat emerges. High-end establishments now advertise not the beauty of their workers, but their ability to maintain body temperature. Plump courtesans, those who still have meat on their bones, command premium rates as living bed warmers. Some creative madams develop thermal menus where clients can choose between slow burn, all-night cuddling, or quick coal, vigorous shared activity to generate rapid warmth. The Church condemns these practices, of course, while quietly arranging similar services for its higher clergy. Manuscripts from the period describe charity dormitories where the pious can huddle together for warmth, though surviving ledgers show these were strictly segregated by class and gender, with the best spots going to generous donors. Historians still argue whether this period saw an increase in pregnancies or a dramatic decrease. The truth is likely both, desperate coupling in cold corners leading to conceptions, while malnutrition caused countless miscarriages. The really dark twist. Some midwives begin offering womb-warming services, promising to keep expectant mothers heated enough to carry to term for a price. Meanwhile, the animal kingdom becomes unwilling participants in this warmth economy. Wealthy households keep chickens in their bedrooms, leading to some awkward pre-dawn wake-up calls. More inventive souls discover that a properly sedated bear makes an excellent space heater, if you can avoid being mauled. The truly destitute resort to burying themselves in piles of composting manure, trading dignity for a few degrees of life-saving warmth. The black market develops specialized heat brokers who traffic in everything from stolen fireplace embers to illicitly obtained wool. The most sought-after commodity: stories. A skilled storyteller who can make listeners forget their frozen toes for an hour can eat for free in any tavern. Some particularly clever souls combine trades, offering both physical warmth and mental escape in bundled packages. As the cold persists, people develop bizarre rituals to cope. Fever dances, where participants work themselves into sweaty exhaustion. Breath-sharing ceremonies where entire villages exhale into sealed jars, then inhale the collective warmth during particularly cold nights. The line between practical survival strategy and mass delusion becomes dangerously thin. The cold doesn't just linger, it evolves. By the third year without proper summers, the world has become something from an old wives' tale gone horribly wrong. You wake to frost in July, your breath hanging frozen before your face even as the calendar claims it should be harvest season. The rivers that once carried trade goods now stand as motionless highways of ice, their surfaces scarred by the desperate tracks of those trying to escape dying villages. The new world order of cold. Mainstream climate records show temperatures dropped an average of 2.5 degrees Celsius globally, enough to decimate agriculture but not enough to kill outright. The real terror came in the microclimates, valleys where the cold pooled like water, creating pockets of permanent winter. In these places, the freeze did something unprecedented. It preserved the dead perfectly. There are accounts of travelers stumbling upon whole families frozen at their dinner tables, the gruesome scenes kept pristine by the unrelenting cold. Some superstitious villagers began worshipping these ice saints, believing them to be holy figures waiting for resurrection. The black market in warmth. As fuel supplies dwindled, a new criminal class emerged: the ember thieves who would brave burning buildings not to save lives, but to steal the flames. The most skilled could transport live coals for miles using ingenious clay containers lined with asbestos fibers. Yes, they knew about asbestos in the 6th century. These fire runners became both reviled and indispensable, their services commanding prices that would make modern drug lords blush. Biological anomalies. The cold did strange things to living things. Some trees, desperate for sunlight, grew transparent bark, a phenomenon modern botanists still can't fully explain. Wolves began exhibiting unheard-of pack behavior, some even breaking into homes not to attack, but to curl up beside human families for shared warmth. The most bizarre reports come from coastal regions where fish were found frozen vertically in the ice, their bodies perfectly preserved in midswim. The ice wine scandal. In a macabre twist of fate, the cold created one valuable commodity. Grapes that froze on the vine produced an intensely sweet wine. Monasteries that had quietly been producing this ice wine found themselves at the center of a church investigation when it was discovered some were watering down communion wine with the precious vintage. The subsequent trial revealed an entire underground economy of sacramental wine smuggling that reached to the highest levels of the clergy. Frozen time. The cold affected human perception in eerie ways. Without seasonal markers, people lost track of time. There are accounts of villages celebrating Christmas in what was actually August. Some individuals reportedly aged at visibly different rates, a phenomenon modern scientists attribute to extreme stress and malnutrition, but which contemporaries saw as witchcraft or divine judgment. The ice mirage trade. Enterprising hucksters began selling visions of summer, elaborate ice sculptures depicting warm scenes that would slowly melt in buyers' homes. The most skilled artisans could make a block of ice last for days, creating the illusion of a temporary return to normalcy. Some desperate souls became addicted to these frozen fantasies, spending their last coins on ever larger ice sculptures until they froze to death in their own homes. The cold's last joke. As the world began warming again, the melting ice revealed horrors. Bodies preserved with their final expressions of terror, entire villages that had vanished now reappearing, their last moments frozen in time. Some of these ice ghosts became macabre tourist attractions, while others were said to carry curses. The final cruel twist. The thaw brought floods that destroyed what little the cold hadn't already claimed. The roads out of dying villages are littered with the detritus of collapsed lives, abandoned carts, scattered belongings, and the occasional corpse half buried in snow. But what's most unsettling is the silence. No weeping, no arguments about which path to take. Just the soft crunch of frost underfoot as whole communities walk away from everything they've ever known. This isn't migration. It's something far more primal. The human animal, cornered by climate, is doing what it's always done, moving toward the rumor of survival. The new nomads. Mainstream histories focus on the great migrations of tribes, but the real story is in the countless unnamed families walking south until the cold lessens. They develop a whole culture of the road, secret symbols carved into tree bark to indicate safe paths or poisoned water sources. Some take to traveling at night, not for secrecy but because the frozen ground is easier to walk on. Their most precious possession. Not gold or weapons, but simple wooden staffs with notches marking each day traveled toward hoped-for warmth. The ghost caravans. As conditions worsen, more desperate measures emerge. Wealthy landowners hire body wagons, modified carts with human-sized compartments where the rich can ride in relative comfort while teams of starving men pull them south. The compartments are lined with stolen church vestments for insulation, and the whole contraption smells of sweat and despair. More disturbing are the silent trains, lines of refugees roped together at the waist to prevent anyone from wandering off or collapsing unnoticed. When someone does die mid-journey, they're cut loose without ceremony, their frozen bodies left standing like grotesque road markers. The children's crusade. A chilling phenomenon emerges among the young. Groups of children, some as young as 6, begin appearing at monastery gates claiming to be seeking the sun. Whether this was organized by desperate parents or sprang from some collective survival instinct remains unclear. What we know is that these bands developed their own hierarchy and rules, with the oldest carrying maps drawn from half-remembered sermons about warmer lands to the south. Some monks report the children speak in unison when asking for bread, their voices eerily synchronized. The Underground Railroad in reverse. In a bitter twist, the old escape routes used by slaves become paths to freedom again, but now everyone is fleeing. Cave systems that once hid runaway bondsmen now shelter whole families. The conductors this time are former soldiers who remember where the army stored emergency grain caches decades earlier. They guide groups between these hidden stockpiles in journeys that can take months. The price for their service. Not money, but marriage promises, a guarantee their bloodlines will continue if civilization ever recovers. The language of loss. As the displaced multiply, a new dialect emerges, a patois of survival terms from a dozen languages. The word hunger becomes taboo, replaced by euphemisms like the long quiet or St. Martin's embrace. Directions take on spiritual meanings. South is always toward light, while north becomes the white death. The most heartbreaking linguistic development is the disappearance of future tense verbs in some groups, a grammatical surrender to perpetual present misery. The settlements that weren't. Archaeologists would later find evidence of almost villages, places where migrants started building shelters but then moved on as the cold followed them. These sites share eerie commonalities: half-built churches with foundations in the shape of sun symbols, communal ovens that never saw fire, and graves containing multiple bodies arranged in sleeping positions. The most poignant finds are the story stones, rocks where travelers carved brief accounts of their journeys before moving on, creating a fragmented autobiography of collapse. The boat people. As land routes prove deadly, The desperate take to the sea in anything that floats. The Mediterranean becomes dotted with makeshift rafts carrying people who'd never seen the ocean before this catastrophe. Some vessels are little more than doors tied together with rope, yet they carry whole families toward the rumor of African warmth. The lucky ones make it to shore with salt-cracked lips and unbelievable tales. The unlucky become part of a new maritime hazard, ghost flotsam, the frozen bodies of refugees that float for months before washing up on distant beaches. The last walkers. When the climate finally begins improving years later, the roads still aren't safe. Bandits now far outnumber honest travelers, and the few remaining refugees have become feral in their survival instincts. Some develop a sixth sense for finding abandoned food caches. Others can smell snow before it falls. All share one characteristic: they never fully stop moving, even when they reach safety, their bodies conditioned to constant migration. Doctors of the time call it walker's heart, a condition where the pulse never quite slows to normal, as if the body remains ready to flee at any moment. The unsettled earth. The greatest legacy of this exodus isn't the population shifts or changed borders, but something more fundamental: the death of the idea that home is permanent. 4 generations afterward, families that survived would keep journey bags packed with essentials, even during times of plenty. The trauma of being unhomed by climate would echo through centuries, manifesting in everything from architectural styles favoring portable wealth to religious festivals celebrating roots over roots. The babies born in the years of perpetual twilight enter a world unlike any before it. Their first breaths draw in air thick with volcanic particulates. Their first cries echo through villages where laughter has become a forgotten sound. These ash children will bear the marks of 536 throughout their lives, not just in stunted growth and weakened bones, but in ways science is still unraveling centuries later. A generation marked before birth. Mainstream medical histories note the dramatic increase in birth defects during this period. Cleft palates, twisted limbs, eyes that never learn to focus. But the more subtle changes only become apparent with time. Midwives' journals describe newborns with strangely ashen skin that never quite warms to proper color, and an unsettling quietness. These babies cry less, startle more easily at sudden light, and develop an uncanny ability to sleep through the frequent earth tremors. The most disturbing trend appears around the 9th month after the worst of the famine, a spike in births of what terrified mothers call old souls. These infants enter the world with open eyes that track movement with unsettling precision, their gazes seeming to weigh and judge the broken world they've joined. Some refuse breast milk unless the mother has eaten within the hour, as if they can taste the starvation through her skin. The milk dilemma. With most livestock dead or slaughtered, wet nurses become worth their weight in gold when they can produce milk at all. Desperate families turn to horrifying alternatives. Gruels made from boiled leather, tree sap thickened with crushed insects, even the white moss that grows on north-facing rocks. The results are predictably tragic. Infant mortality rates reach 70% in some regions. But the survivors? They develop digestive systems unlike anything seen before. Modern analysis of skeletal remains shows these children's bodies adapted to extract nutrients from substances that would poison ordinary humans. Their teeth show unique wear patterns from chewing bark and bone matter. Their stomachs shrunken to accommodate 1 or 2 sparse meals per day. The games they played. Childhood in this era becomes a dark mirror of normal development. Instead of tag, children play find the seed, scavenging through animal dung for undigested grains. Dolls are fashioned from bundled rags stuffed with dried leaves for insulation, their faces drawn with charcoal from dead hearths. The most popular game is called sun spotting, where children stare at the perpetual haze until someone hallucinates a glimpse of yellow light. Education of necessity. Schooling shifts dramatically from philosophy and letters to pure survival skills. Children memorize which tree barks can be boiled into something resembling nourishment, which mushrooms cause visions rather than death, how to test frozen rivers for thin ice by listening to the echoes of their footsteps. The brightest are taught sky reading, interpreting subtle variations in the omnipresent gloom to predict coming storms or volcanic events. The night eyes phenomenon. As these children grow, reports emerge of strange adaptations. Some develop the ability to see remarkably well in near-total darkness, pupils that dilate to cover almost the entire visible eye. Others claim to hear whispers from miles away when the wind is right. Most unsettling are those said to taste weather, licking their fingers and holding them up to predict storms with uncanny accuracy. The lost milestones. Without reliable seasons, traditional coming-of-age ceremonies collapse. Puberty arrives late and irregular. Some girls don't menstruate until 18 or older, while some boys' voices never fully deepen. Marriage ages plummet as families rush to secure alliances before starvation claims them all. The concept of adulthood blurs into mere survival. You're grown when you can go 3 days without food and still work. The ghost choirs. In what may be mass hysteria or something stranger, multiple regions report groups of Ash children singing in perfect unison despite being miles apart. The songs have no identifiable origin, not folk tunes nor church hymns, and the lyrics, when decipherable, speak of the great cold beneath the earth and rivers that flow backward. Church authorities initially believe it's demonic possession until several choristers accurately predict volcanic eruptions days in advance. The second-generation curse. When these children eventually have offspring of their own, the trauma echoes in unexpected ways. An unusually high percentage are born with vitiligo-like skin patterns resembling ash fall, or with teeth that emerge fully formed but brittle as chalk. Some exhibit phobias of clear skies, becoming hysterical on the rare days when the sun shines unobstructed. The few surviving medical texts of the era call it the shadow sickness, a melancholia that seems passed through the blood. Their legacy in bone. Centuries later, archaeologists will identify this generation by distinct skeletal markers, growth arrest lines that record each famine period like tree rings, tooth enamel showing unprecedented levels of heavy metals from the volcanic ash, and in some cases, bones that fluoresce faintly under UV light due to unusual mineral absorption. The children who remembered too much. The most haunting accounts come from those who survived into old age. They speak of remembering their own births, of recognizing the taste of volcanic ash from some preconscious memory, of dreams that aren't dreams but recollections of the womb starvation. Some develop an irrational fear of clear skies, convinced the sun's return is just another disaster waiting to happen. These ash children, those who lived, would go on to rebuild civilization, but always with one eye on the sky. They instilled in their descendants both a terror of famine and an almost supernatural ability to prepare for it. The root cellars, the emergency seed banks, the folk tales warning against overabundance, all trace back to this generation that never knew a full stomach or a sunny day. As the Christian God's silence stretches into years, the old deities stir in the collective unconscious. You see it first in the countryside, villagers leaving offerings at long-abandoned shrines, whispering names not spoken aloud for generations. The pantheons of displaced peoples, the local nature spirits, the household gods everyone claimed to have forgotten, they all come creeping back as the perpetual twilight continues. The underground revival. Mainstream religious histories focus on the official church response to the disaster, but the real spiritual revolution happens in cellars and forest clearings. Celtic peasants begin reconstructing solar wheel symbols from memory, though the designs grow distorted with each passing generation. Germanic tribes secretly revive the cult of Nerthus, the Earth Mother, with underground ceremonies where participants drink from bowls carved from glacial ice. The most organized resistance comes from the remnants of Mithraism, the once popular mystery cult that had been fading before the catastrophe. Their underground temples become hubs of clandestine worship, where initiates share techniques for preserving food alongside rituals meant to strengthen the weakening sun. The blood bargains. As desperation grows, so does the extremism of worship. Isolated villages begin practicing a corrupted form of the old Taurobolium rites, slaughtering bulls and letting the blood pour over standing stones in hopes of restoring fertility to the land. More disturbing are the reports from Gaul of white sacrifices, milk-white animals left to freeze in sacred groves as offerings to forgotten winter spirits. Historians still argue whether these practices represented true religious revival or merely psychological coping mechanisms. The archaeological record shows sudden reappearances of ancient votive objects, Bronze Age fertility charms found carefully placed in 6th century ruins, Iron Age weapon deposits suddenly dug up and repurposed as ritual items. The oracle economy. With church prophecies failing, a new class of spiritual guides emerges. Some are outright frauds, charlatans using basic astronomy to predict the sun's return. Others seem genuinely convinced of their visions, including the famous Black Madonna of Arles, a peasant woman who fell into trances and described detailed visions of a sun beneath the earth. The most sought-after seers are children born during the first year of darkness. Many develop strange sensitivities, claiming to hear the whispers of stones or predict volcanic activity through dreams. Wealthy patrons keep them as living divination tools, while the church struggles to determine whether they're blessed or demonic. The new syncretism. An unspoken blending of faiths occurs in the shadows. Christian saints quietly acquire attributes of pagan deities. Saint Brigid becomes simultaneously a Celtic fire goddess and a guardian of hearths. Crucifixes appear with subtle solar halos not sanctioned by any bishop. Even the Eucharist transforms in some regions, with worshippers adding honey, an ancient symbol of immortality, to the communion wine. The night processions. After years without proper daylight, some communities develop nocturnal religious practices. Moonless nights become sacred, with worshippers carrying lanterns in elaborate patterns meant to mimic the lost constellations. The most striking are the veil dances of northern Italy, ceremonies where participants wear translucent fabrics to symbolize the thinning barrier between worlds. The return of the oracle bones. In a bizarre throwback to Shang dynasty practices, reports emerge of priests reading cracks in animal bones again, not for divination, but to predict volcanic activity. The practice spreads rapidly despite church condemnation, with each region developing its own variations. Some use bird bones for atmospheric predictions, while others prefer the shoulder blades of deer for interpreting earth tremors. The shadow scriptures. A whole underground literature emerges, apocalyptic texts blending Christian eschatology with pagan cosmology. The most famous, the Book of the Ash, describes the volcanic winter as a necessary cleansing before a new golden age. Copies circulate secretly, often disguised as psalters or agricultural manuals. The last pagan stronghold. Deep in the Balkan Mountains, a community of crypto-pagans survives by posing as an eccentric Christian sect. Their church contains a perfect stone circle hidden beneath a wooden floor, raised only during secret ceremonies. They preserve agricultural knowledge lost elsewhere, using lunar cycles rather than solar ones to time their plantings. The god of broken things. A new deity emerges spontaneously across multiple regions, a patron of shattered pottery, mended tools, and scarred survivors. No one preaches this cult. It simply appears in the folk traditions of disparate peoples. Offerings to this nameless god include the last shard of a broken bowl, or the final stitch that closes a wound. The Twilight baptisms. As the crisis continues, some communities develop initiation rites for children born after the catastrophe. These involve immersion in icy streams at dawn, not to wash away sin, but to teach their bodies the taste of cold. The practice horrifies church authorities but persists in remote areas. The final irony. When the sun finally does return in full, many of these revived pagan practices don't disappear. They get absorbed into local Christian traditions. The maypole dances, the harvest blessings, even some forms of divination persist for centuries under thin Christian veneers. The disaster's greatest spiritual legacy may be the cracks it created in medieval Christianity's monopoly, cracks through which the old gods never fully disappeared. As central authority collapses across Europe and Asia, something extraordinary emerges from the political vacuum. Not chaos, but hundreds of micro-civilizations, each adapting to the endless winter in radically different ways. You could walk 50 miles and pass through 3 different societies with entirely novel systems of governance, economy, and justice, all forged in the crucible of catastrophe. The Ice Parliament. Mainstream history records the collapse of kingdoms, but not the bizarre experiments that followed. In the Alps, a confederation of villages establishes what later chroniclers call the frozen democracy, a government by lottery where leadership duties rotate weekly among all adult survivors. Their most famous and chilling innovation. The snow vote, where important decisions are written on birch bark and left overnight. The option with the least frost damage by morning is considered divinely approved. Further north, a warlord establishes the Kingdom of Last Light in an abandoned Roman fort, his legitimacy based entirely on possessing one of the few functioning sundials that can still track time through the haze. His subjects pay taxes in shadows, literally marking out their land's diminishing shade patterns on vellum for royal archives. The currency of memory. With precious metals worthless, some communities develop astonishing alternative economies. A chain of monasteries along the Rhone creates a knowledge coinage system where scriptorium time can be traded for food. The more elegant your penmanship, the better you eat. In the Carpathian Basin, a nomadic group uses storytelling as currency, with particularly vivid tales becoming a form of legal tender that can purchase livestock or marriage rights. The most haunting is the bone token system developed in Brittany. Small carved fragments of human remains, always from volunteered corpses, used to represent debts between survivors. The tokens grow lighter as the debt is repaid, the bone slowly wearing away through handling until nothing remains. The shadow courts. Legal systems mutate to address unprecedented crimes. A village in Wales holds its trials at midnight, believing darkness makes liars easier to detect. Along the Danube, judges weigh cases using scales where one pan holds evidence and the other contains snow. The faster it melts, the more heated, and therefore guilty, the defendant is presumed to be. In what's now Burgundy, archaeologists have found evidence of reverse juries. Instead of deciding guilt, these panels determine which laws should be broken for communal survival. Their most famous ruling: that stealing food from the dead is not only permitted but morally required if it saves living children. The whisper networks. With traditional communication collapsed, women develop clandestine information highways using laundry patterns, herb bundles hung in doorways, and the arrangement of cooking fires. This smoke signal feminism allows warnings about dangerous men to spread across regions faster than any royal courier could travel. In some areas, these networks evolve into full parallel governments, the silent councils that handle everything from rationing to dispute resolution while male leaders are distracted by ceremonial duties. The Children's Crusade against winter. The most poignant political movement emerges among adolescents. Across multiple regions, bands of teenagers declare war on winter itself, building enormous straw effigies of frost giants to burn, chipping away at glacier with stolen tools, and in one memorable incident, attempting to negotiate with a frozen lake by throwing all their village's remaining metal into it as tribute. These movements often end tragically, the famous Snow March where 300 youths walked into a blizzard singing hymns, but they leave an enduring cultural legacy, the concept that nature itself could be held accountable like any tyrant. The refugee palaces. In Constantinople, the wealthy turn their mansions into vertical villages, with different floors housing distinct refugee groups. The ground floor might shelter Armenian farmers who teach terrace gardening on balconies, while upper levels house Italian glassmakers creating makeshift greenhouses. These become microcosms of cultural exchange and tension, with elaborate etiquette systems developing around shared stairwells and contested roof space for drying food. The election of the ugliest. Some communities embrace radical egalitarianism by selecting leaders based on who has suffered most visibly. The more scars, missing digits, or frostbite damage, the more qualified one is considered to govern. The Council of the Marked in northern Gaul requires members to display their starvation wounds during deliberations as a reminder of the stakes. The frozen archives. A monastery in the Pyrenees develops a novel method of record keeping. Important documents are etched onto ice blocks stored in deep caves, to be recopied each spring before they melt. The system works until warmer years when entire years of history disappear in sudden drips. The shadow diplomacy. Between these microstates, a strange form of international relations emerges. Villages send cold ambassadors, individuals who've survived particularly harsh winters as envoys. Trade agreements are sealed not with signatures but with exchanges of children for fixed periods, less hostage-taking than mutual insurance. The most sought-after commodity in inter-village negotiations. Recipes for making nutritious food from previously inedible materials. The census of the living dead. Several regions implement radical population tracking, not counting the living, but meticulously recording the dead through winter. The White Scrolls of Provence list names in special ink that darkens with time. Each spring, survivors erase names of those who made it through, leaving only the lost legible. These become sacred documents, the negative space of survival. The end of the experiment. When centralized powers eventually reassert control, they find subjects profoundly changed. The generations who came of age in these micro-civilizations retained stubborn independence and innovative thinking, qualities that will both fuel future progress and ensure constant tension with resurgent monarchies. The greatest legacy of 536 political experiments may be the proof that human societies can reinvent themselves under even the most extreme pressures. When the world becomes unrecognizable, words must transform to carry new meanings, or collapse under the weight of realities they were never meant to describe. You wouldn't recognize the dialects emerging from the ash-choked villages of 536, where language mutates faster than crops can fail. Verbs develop new tenses to describe perpetual uncertainty. Nouns fracture into specialized terms for varieties of hunger. Even silence acquires elaborate new vocabulary. The grammar of desperation. Mainstream linguistics focuses on how Latin persisted through the crisis, but the real story unfolds in the makeshift dialects of survivors. In the Alpine valleys, people stop using future tense altogether, instead employing a new maybe tense that expresses both hope and doubt in every utterance. Tomorrow maybe rain, maybe not becomes a complete sentence. Along the Danube, a peculiar double negative emerges as the preferred form of optimism. Not unhopeful carries more weight than simple hopeful because it acknowledges the darkness while refusing to surrender completely. The most fascinating development comes from coastal communities, where tidal terms get repurposed for volcanic ash patterns, high smokes meaning heavy fallout days, ash neeps describing periods of relatively clear air. Fishermen's moon calendars become crucial for predicting volcanic activity cycles. The whisper lexicon. With so many ears straining for news of food or danger, communities develop elaborate coded languages. In Brittany, women communicate through the patterns of knots in their hair. A braid tied left means strangers approach, while right means food here. Blacksmiths across Gaul develop a hammer speech where the rhythm of their work conveys messages. 3 quick strikes followed by a pause might warn of tax collectors coming. The most sophisticated is the bread tongue of monastic bakeries. Specific types of loaf shapes and scoring patterns that indicate everything from safe travel routes to which noble houses are hoarding grain. When authorities catch on, the monks switch to encoding messages in the density of crumb structure. The death of color. As the world turns grey, color terms begin disappearing from daily speech. Generations raised under the ash cloud develop only 4 basic color categories: dark, light, wet, and dry. When the sun finally returns, chroniclers note widespread inability to describe hues. One account tells of a woman weeping before a sunset because she had no words for orange. The new sacred texts. With traditional scripture failing to explain their suffering, people begin finding divine messages elsewhere. In Lombardy, a cult forms around interpreting the crack patterns in parched earth. Welsh shepherds develop a system of prophecy based on which directions their surviving sheep choose to graze. The most poignant are the hunger psalters, ordinary prayer books where believers underline letters that seem to form secret words when viewed diagonally across multiple pages. The soundscape of survival. Acoustic environments change dramatically without birdsong or children's laughter. People become hypersensitive to specific frequencies. The crunch of a stranger's footsteps on frost carries farther than shouted warnings. Some villages employ professional listeners who can detect distant avalanches or approaching riders hours before anyone else. This auditory shift produces new musical forms. The ash lullabies of northern Gaul use only 3-note ranges matching the limited vocal capacity of starving singers. Funeral dirges incorporate the actual sounds of coughing and labored breathing as rhythmic elements. The gesture revolution. With many too weak to speak, an elaborate language of gestures emerges. In Constantinople's refugee camps, finger movements can indicate everything from safe water source to plague in that sector. Some signs are adapted from forgotten Roman military codes, others from monastic sign languages, but most develop spontaneously from shared necessity. The most heartbreaking are the family signs, unique gestures developed within kinship groups to express concepts normal language can't capture. A particular way of touching one's elbow might mean "I loved you before the hunger came." Pressing a palm to the throat could signify "we will remember your voice." The birth of news. Traditional information networks collapse, giving rise to protojournalism. In Italy, ash criers travel between settlements performing spoken word summaries of events, part news, part entertainment, part survival tips. Their performances follow strict poetic meters to aid memorization, with refrains like "trust, not the clear sky" repeated like choruses. More innovative are the story chains, narrative fragments passed from village to village, each teller adding their own chapter before sending it onward. Some evolve into elaborate sagas over months of travel, their plots reflecting the changing concerns of communities along the route. The silence words. As death becomes omnipresent, languages develop specialized terms for types of quiet. The hush when a village realizes its last seed grain is gone, white silence. The pause between a sick child's breaths, knife quiet. The terrible stillness when refugees discover an abandoned settlement with no bodies, ghost hush. The unlearning. Perhaps the most profound linguistic shift is what disappears. Concepts like harvest festival or summer love fade from active vocabulary. The Frankish dialect around Mainz loses all words for green over a generation. Future tense verbs atrophy from disuse. Why discuss tomorrow when today is barely endurable? Yet from this narrowing emerges surprising precision. The same Alpine dialect that abandoned color terms develops 14 distinct words for hunger, each describing a specific physiological stage from stomach cramps to hallucination. Icelandic fishermen create an elaborate vocabulary for varieties of cold that would baffle modern meteorologists. The echoes forward. When the climate finally stabilizes, these linguistic adaptations don't vanish, they seep into the languages we know today. Our modern words starve, originally meaning any severe suffering, dreary, from the Old English for bloody, and even hope, cognate with hopping, reflecting desperate movement toward salvation, all carry traces of 536 linguistic trauma. The crisis proves language isn't just a tool for describing reality. It's a living thing that starves and adapts and mutates alongside its speakers. The words that survived did so because they were tough enough, or flexible enough, to weather the longest winter. When civilization's veneer cracks open, humanity's raw ingenuity spills out in strange and beautiful patterns. The year 536 doesn't just test human endurance, it becomes an accidental laboratory where survivors conduct radical experiments in agriculture, medicine, and social organization without even realizing they're pioneering. What emerges is a shadow science, practical knowledge forged in desperation, often more effective than the scholarly theories it replaces. The volcanic alchemists. Mainstream histories focus on the collapse of scholarship, but in hidden corners, a new kind of practical science thrives. Monastic winemakers become accidental meteorologists, tracking atmospheric changes through the taste of their vintages, noting how ashfall alters fermentation in predictable ways. Blacksmiths, deprived of quality ore, develop sophisticated alloy combinations using whatever metals they can scavenge, creating famine steel that's weaker but more corrosion-resistant than traditional blends. The most fascinating figures are the ash chemists, often women who had previously worked with fabrics or dyes, who discover that different volcanic deposits have distinct properties. Some make excellent pottery glazes when mixed with urine. Others can preserve meat surprisingly well. Their recipe books, passed hand to hand, become the era's most valuable texts. The hunger physicians. With traditional medicine useless against famine-related illnesses, a brutal new medical paradigm emerges. Doctors note that patients who survive past certain thresholds, usually around 40 days of starvation, develop strange resistance to conditions that kill the newly hungry. This leads to the controversial starvation cures, where the mildly ill are deliberately underfed to trigger these adaptations. Other innovations are more ingenious. Midwives develop a twilight sleep technique using carefully dosed combinations of hemlock and mint to ease childbirth pains while conserving the mother's energy. Bonesetters learn to use frozen mud as natural casts. The most radical innovation comes from plague doctors, who notice that wrapping patients in fabric used to strain vinegar seems to slow infection rates, a crude predecessor to germ theory. The astronomy of desperation. Traditional astronomy collapses along with the clear skies, but new celestial sciences emerge. Haze readers track subtle variations in the grey canopy to predict weather patterns, developing a complex classification system for cloud textures and ash densities. Some become so skilled they can estimate the direction and distance of volcanic eruptions based on how particulates drift. Meanwhile, timekeeping undergoes radical changes. With no visible sun for proper noon marks, communities develop hunger clocks based on bodily rhythms. The time between morning thirst and first stomach pang becomes a standard unit. More accurate are the candle calendars, where notches track how long different wax blends burn under controlled conditions. The new agriculture. Farming transforms beyond recognition. In Ireland, peasants discover that alternating potato plots with lichen beds prevents soil depletion, a technique that won't be formally documented for centuries. Italian vineyards develop the black pruning method, deliberately stressing vines to produce fewer but hardier grapes. The most revolutionary innovation comes from Anatolia, where farmers begin cultivating mushrooms in underground tunnels, not just for food, but for their warming properties as decomposers. These hot caves become crucial survival hubs, with temperature differentials carefully managed by adjusting ventilation and moisture. Some families essentially move underground for years at a time. The physics of scarcity. Everyday objects get re-engineered for maximum efficiency. Oil lamps are redesigned with spiral wicks that burn 30% longer. Spinning wheels get modified to work with shorter fiber lengths from malnourished sheep. Even children's toys evolve. Tops are weighted to spin longer with less energy input. Dolls made with hollow compartments to store precious seeds. The most impressive feats come in construction. With timber scarce, builders rediscover ancient Roman concrete formulas and improve upon them, using volcanic ash as a key ingredient. Some structures from this period still stand today, their unusual composition making them more resistant to earthquakes than later medieval buildings. The mathematics of less. Numerical systems adapt to shrinking realities. Many regions abandon fractions altogether. When nothing exists to divide, why bother? Others develop elaborate sharing algorithms where a single fish might be distributed among 12 families according to complex need-based calculations. The most haunting mathematical artifact is the death ratio used by some villages, a constantly updated figure representing how many must die each week for the rest to have minimal sustenance. Grim as it sounds, this calculus saves countless communities from complete collapse. The survival archives. Unlike formal scholars, these practical scientists rarely write down their discoveries. They're too busy surviving. Knowledge passes through demonstration and song, encoded in folk tunes with precise instructions for things like purifying water or predicting frost. The few surviving written records are cryptic by design. Recipe books where a pinch of salt might actually mean crushed bone ash, or agricultural manuals with deliberately misleading measurements to protect trade secrets. The legacy in our bones. Modern analysis reveals how these adaptations literally reshaped human biology. Skeletons from the late 500s show distinct changes in bone density and tooth structure, evolutionary responses to nutritional stress that persist in some populations today. Even our gut microbiomes carry traces of 536 dietary shifts, with certain famine-resistant bacteria becoming permanently established in human digestive systems. Perhaps the most profound scientific legacy is psychological. The generations that survived developed what modern researchers call catastrophe cognition, enhanced pattern recognition for subtle environmental threats, combined with unusual creativity in problem-solving under constraints. These traits, forged in desperation, became humanity's inheritance from its darkest century. The first true sunrise in 18 months arrives without fanfare. Just a gradual brightening of the grey until, one morning, you realize you can see your shadow for the first time in living memory. But this isn't the triumphant return of light the prophets promised. The world that emerges from the ash is irrevocably changed, and so are the people in it. Recovery proves almost as traumatic as the catastrophe itself, revealing uncomfortable truths about what survival really costs. The light sickness. Mainstream records celebrate the sun's return, but few mention the wave of medical crises it triggers. After years in twilight, thousands suffer debilitating light sensitivity. Their pupils, permanently dilated from constant darkness, refuse to contract properly. Chroniclers describe people wearing veils for years afterward, their eyes streaming tears at ordinary daylight. More disturbing are the psychological reactions. Some survivors develop crippling anxiety when exposed to direct sunlight, convinced it's another disaster beginning. The agricultural consequences are equally unexpected. The first crops grown under renewed sunlight often fail. The plants, bred through generations of artificial selection in low light, can't handle full photosynthesis. An entire subspecialty of sun farming emerges to gradually acclimate vegetation to normal conditions again. The weight of full stomachs. After years of starvation, the return of reliable harvests brings its own dangers. Accounts from monasteries describe gorging deaths, people literally eating themselves to death when food becomes plentiful again. More insidious are the metabolic disorders that plague survivors for generations. Bodies conditioned to extreme scarcity struggle with abundance. The psychological impacts run deeper. Many develop what modern scholars now recognize as early descriptions of survivors' guilt, an inability to enjoy meals knowing others still starve, or irrational hoarding behaviors that persist for decades. Some communities institutionalize remembrance fasts where all voluntarily return to famine rations for set periods, both to honor the dead and to prepare children for future hardships. The Great Dislocation. As climate stabilizes, the population movements sparked by catastrophe don't reverse, they calcify. The refugee camps outside Constantinople become permanent neighborhoods. The alpine valleys emptied by famine are never fully repopulated. An entire generation has grown up nomadic, and many refuse to settle even when conditions improve. This creates bizarre cultural hybrids, North African farming techniques in German forests, Syrian architectural styles in French villages. The traditional geographic boundaries of cultures and peoples become hopelessly blurred, sparking identity crises that take centuries to resolve. The memory wars. As recovery begins, competing narratives emerge about what really happened. The aristocracy insists it was a temporary hardship they nobly endured. The peasantry remembers it as proof of elite incompetence. The church declares it divine punishment. The surviving pagans whisper it was nature's revenge. These tensions explode in unexpected ways. In Gaul, peasants burn manor houses that had hoarded grain. In Italy, mobs destroy churches that had charged for famine relief. The most violent conflicts arise over memorials, whether to build monuments honoring the dead or to erase all physical reminders of the trauma. The new abnormal. Even after the climate stabilizes, nothing truly returns to normal. The generations that lived through 536 instill in their children a perpetual preparedness mindset. Cellars are kept stocked even during plenty. Multiple harvest festivals are established as insurance against future failures. The very concept of season carries traumatic weight it never did before. This paranoia proves prescient. Tree ring data shows the climate remains unstable for nearly a century after the initial catastrophe. Each minor cooling event triggers mass panic, creating waves of economic and social disruption disproportionate to the actual threat. The lost arts. Entire categories of knowledge disappear not because they're forgotten, but because they're too painful to preserve. The intricate cloud reading skills developed during the haze years are deliberately not taught to children. Recipes for famine foods are burned rather than passed down. Even the musical scales developed during the crisis fall out of use, their haunting intervals too evocative of loss. The unexpected gifts. Yet from this trauma emerge surprising advances. The necessity of ash-based concrete leads to improved building techniques. The medical adaptations forced by plague result in better understanding of contagion. The population bottlenecks create unexpected genetic diversity as previously isolated groups intermarry. Most profound are the philosophical shifts. Concepts of community responsibility deepen markedly. Legal systems place new emphasis on shared resource management. Even artistic expression changes. The stylized forms of early medieval art give way to startling realism, as if survivors are determined to document the world exactly as they see it. The children of two worlds. Those born during the transition, old enough to remember hunger but young enough to adapt to abundance, become history's great pivot generation. They're the ones who cautiously experiment with surplus, who tentatively rebuild trade networks, who dare to have more than two children again. Their conflicted worldview shapes the emerging medieval period. The castles they build have both grand halls and hidden food stores. Their religious art depicts both heavenly glory and apocalyptic warnings. Even their literature oscillates between exuberance and existential dread. The final lesson. As we look back from our modern world of relative plenty, 536 Greatest Legacy may be its demonstration of human plasticity. The survivors weren't heroes or saints, they were ordinary people who made impossible choices, who compromised their morals and bodies to see another dawn. Their story doesn't offer clean redemption arcs or triumphant recoveries. Just the quiet, messy truth that civilization is more fragile than we admit, and more resilient than we can imagine. As the embers of tonight's story fade to soft ash, remember this: the world you wake to tomorrow, with its predictable sunrise and reliable harvests, is the anomaly. For 18 terrible months, our ancestors lived in a different reality entirely, one where every breath tasted of cinders and hope itself seemed like a dangerous indulgence. Yet here we are, their distant descendants, proof that even the longest winter eventually yields to spring. The scars remain, of course, in our DNA, in our folk memories, in the way we still instinctively store canned goods when storms are forecast. But so does their hard-won wisdom about what truly matters when the trappings of civilization fall away. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, let the hum of your modern comforts, the electric glow behind your eyelids, the steady rhythm of climate control, lull you gently. But spare one thought for those who endured the unendurable, whose names are lost but whose legacy lives on in every bite of food we don't fear to eat, in every sunrise we take for granted.